Today is an auspicious day in our church. We're celebrating Pastor Merle's wonderful tenure as our acting pastor, and we're also celebrating the reuniting of the church's settled pastor, me, with an awesome congregation, you, after 3 months sabbatical. And it's good. It's good to be back. We're also celebrating the 187th anniversary of the church. We were founded on July 26, 1834. One of my sabbatical projects was researching a bit of our church history, and Anniversary Sunday seems like a very good day to share some of it. We started out as a part of an 1830s Christian protest movement that was going on in America. Protesting Christians were leaving religious institutions that didn't take a strong stand against slavery. And the movement had the curious name of coming Outerism, based on the line in our lesson where Paul calls Jesus' followers away from false religious paths that defile and are not holy. Using words from Isaiah, Paul instructs, come out from them, be separate from them. In 1834, one of the most famous coming outerism protests took place at Cincinnati's Lane Seminary. After a series of debates on slavery, which included anti-slavery advocate and seminarian W.T. Allen speaking, the seminarian trustees decided to prohibit any further anti-slavery activity. 75 seminarians left Lane and went to Oberlin's seminary in protest. They became nationally known as the Lane Rebels. And before that protest at Lane Seminary, a less famous coming outerism event occurred in 1834 right here in Mount Vernon. 187 years ago tomorrow, 30 members left the local Presbyterian church to start the area's first anti-slavery church, the Free Presbyterian Church. And that church hired as its first and second pastors two of the famed Lane rebels, Reverend Benjamin Higbee and Reverend Edward Weed. And coming outerism would play a role again in 1849 when the Presbyterian denomination did not take an aggressive enough stand against slavery for the Free Presbyterian Church members, and they left that denomination to become Congregationalists. And ever since, that church has been known as Mount Vernon First Congregational Church. And that is, of course, us. And we didn't just come out of another denomination and another church and hire a couple of Lane rebels. We were very active in the rebellion against slavery and played a leadership role in this county. Early on, the church was part of the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. Reverend Higbee and 4 others connected to the church are listed in the minutes of the first Ohio Anti-Slavery Society convention. It was held just over the hill in Granville. And then we here also hosted anti-slavery speakers and meetings, and we worked on the Underground Railroad with others here in Knox County. And even though Ohio is not a slave state, sadly, many opposed anti-slavery efforts in Ohio. Violent mobs surrounded our first church building and pelted it with rocks and with eggs, and disrupted the speakers with noises loud enough to sometimes be heard more than 3 miles away. And the mobs also chased anti-slavery speakers out of town and even tried to lynch our first speaker, none other than Reverend W.T. Allen, the debater at Lane Seminary, who'd been invited to speak at our church by his classmate, our first pastor, Reverend Higbee. And for future protection, the speakers were escorted by church members, surrounding them as bodyguards. And members of the church also stood guard outside to keep the building safe. One of those members was Charlie Cooper, founder of Cooper Industries, famous back in that day for standing outside and keeping people away from our church property. The local mobs were organized by a group of men ominously called the Meat Axe. That's what they called themselves. And they reportedly called us racist epithets. We call ourselves church, Christians, and followers of Jesus, and as such we also unflinchingly called ourselves anti-slavery, and to this day, we proudly claim that history. And I've heard others in Knox County claim with pride that the area is anti-slavery history, particularly local involvement in the Underground Railroad. And since 1895, the sleeveless windows right there on our east wall have, as far as I can tell, been the only mark in this town of that proud heritage. The windows depict prophet Elijah and young King David as black men. And below them is an inscription that reads, "In memory of the founders of this church and their anti-slavery friends." Those windows are remarkable. They're kind of hidden. They're inside. There's an area in the front of the church that's been cleared off. It's just dirt right now, just below the steps. It's being prepared to hold a public bench honoring and remembering the church and the area's involvement in opposing slavery. And the words on that bench will start with a part of Micah 6 that adorned our sanctuary wall. Seek justice, love, kindness. That quote will be followed by these words. In 1834, we began as an anti-slavery church, working with others to oppose slavery and help courageous black Americans escape slavery on the Underground Railroad as it ran through Mount Vernon. We continue to seek justice and love kindness. We pray others will too. It was illegal to help the escaping slaves. And it was dangerous to keep records, so local efforts on the Underground Railroad are understandably sparsely recorded. But clear and convincing evidence exists that citizens in this county and in this church were very much a part of love-drenched acts of justice, secreting and aiding courageous Americans on the run from slavery. Why? Because slavery was and is awful, ungodly, immoral, and certainly unchristian. And if you've not been to the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, I highly recommend it. But brace yourself. The horrors of slavery, front and center. The first sight most people see is an actual Kentucky slave inn where men, women, and children being marched to slave markets and masters were crammed in, shackled, abused, and locked up for the night. It is a haunting and tearful place. In the Freedom Center, there are many other haunting displays of cruelties and evidence of systemic brutality and inhumanity to Americans, legalized by states, sanctioned by courts, and supported by secular and religious leaders and many citizens. And those displays make it abundantly clear why enslaved Americans sought freedom and why other Americans helped them, and how awful those in favor of slavery behaved. The museum also evidences those other Americans aiding those in by running an Underground Railroad to help brave men, women, and children escape freedom. And Ohio was a big part of that effort. The escape routes called Freedom Trails branched out from the southern border of Ohio to form a vast web of routes all across the state to keep slave catchers guessing and off the trail of those escaping. Three Freedom Trails converged to one into Mount Vernon. They came from areas around Sunbury and Granville and Utica. From Mount Vernon, a Freedom Trail headed up to Townsend's Owl Creek Friends settlement, a mile and a half just north of Fredericton. Local Quakers From Fredericktown, the Freedom Trail split into the Lexington and Belleville branches of the Underground Railroad. Americans seeking freedom would walk, run, swim, boat, ride on wagons to get here, usually under the cover of night. The Ohio Freedom Trails were not literally underground. They were above ground on roads and trails and waterways and sometimes even train tracks. Vast network of allies was in place to help conduct people across the trails while others provided safe places to stop, called stations. Reverend Edward Weed, our second pastor, was involved in that network while he was still at Lake Seminary in Cincinnati. And Reverend Weed and our church and its other pastors from the very start were involved in that network right here in Knox County until slavery was outlawed in the 1860s. And our church records, remarkably, actually had a rather rare recording of two of our folks acting as conductors on the Freedom Trail. One night, in 1842, when a Beat Axe Club mob was busy disrupting an anti-slavery meeting that we were hosting, Reverend Elwell Mead wrote, on that same night, a load of 19 fugitives which had been brought from Appleton the night before in a double wagon by 12-year-old John Scribner were taken on toward the North Star. Mr. Travis under the cover of storm and darkness. 12. John Scribner from this church was a brave conductor on the Underground Railroad, as was an adult Mr. D.L. Travis. Three cheers for those two, and this church and many others in the area who dared to get involved. Daily, across the nation, allies did the dangerous work of aiding in the transport and secretly feeding and housing courageous men, women, and children involved in the even more dangerous and courageous act of escaping slavery. And this church was not alone in the local effort. I already mentioned the Quakers. The free black citizens in the area were no doubt allies too. But I can only find 4 people identified in writing as station masters in Knox County, and I want to lift those names up: Thomas Townsend, William Bonner, and Eli and Rachel Nichols. But there's also oral history that St. Paul Episcopal Church basement served as a station. The Curtis family from that church is rumored to have had stations at that big old Curtis mansion and at the Curtis Crypt in Mountain View Cemetery and a little Curtis House, the white one, in Cupola at the end of North Main Street. People acting as Christ's hands and feet and voices, seeking justice and loving kindness, have very deep roots in this county, in this church. And it's good for us to remember on this anniversary weekend that in 1834, we began as an anti-slavery church working with others to oppose slavery and help courageous black Americans escape slavery on the Underground Railroad as it ran through Mountain View. It continues